Brian, what does it mean to say that God is good?
One thing it means is that if God has any obligations, he meets them. A second is that God is perfectly virtuous. And that second thing leads naturally to a third. If you're perfectly virtuous, you don't just meet your obligations, you go beyond them. If I'm a perfectly loving person, for example, it might be that I'm only obligated to see my parents once or twice a year. I don't know how exactly you work the numbers out, but if I'm perfectly loving, I'll go beyond that. I'll see them more if I can.
Okay, well, let's look at each of the components. Obligations. Some would say that God has no obligations because the only things that are important are what God says. There's no higher morality than God, so morality is what God says.
I think even if that were true, God would still have obligations because he could legislate obligations for himself. Think, for example, the federal government. The Congress passes a law that says everybody has to pay such and such taxes. Well, that applies to them too. They're obligated to pay those. They don't always pay them, but they're obligated to do it. In the same way, if God passes a law, so to speak, that says nobody's allowed to lie, that applies to him as well.
And so obligations, but let's get to, I mean, what is the nature of good? What is the nature of good? It sounds very legalistic that everything is kind of designed on a plan, but is there an emotion to this good? I mean, what is the good that God is doing? A creation, or making us into interesting people?
Okay, so far we've talked about goodness only in abstract terms. Where you get more flesh on it is if you consider what God's virtues are. If he's perfectly benevolent and perfectly generous, for example, then he's going to have a natural impetus toward making good things and giving them good gifts. And so the idea that God is perfectly virtuous gives a push toward the idea that God will create and will create a good universe.
So are we talking about two broad categories, obligations and virtues?
Right. Right.
And how then do you would say that God is perfect in these, because God's perfect in everything, and God's infinite? Are they the same thing?
They're very closely related. I would define perfection in virtue in terms of a certain notion of infinity. I would say, for example, that to say that God is perfectly benevolent is to say he's so benevolent that to the extent that any of his actions don't reflect benevolence, that's not because of any lack of benevolence that he has. Now, I want to focus on two things. Notice first off that the definition talked about his not having a lack of benevolence. No lack, no limitation. Limitation would imply finiteness. So when I said that God has no lack at all of benevolence, really the notion of his being infinitely benevolent was beneath the surface there. The other thing I want to point out about that definition is that it does allow that God can do actions that don't manifest benevolence. All it insists on is that if he does those, the reason is not because he isn't benevolent. It's because of something else. Maybe, for example, it's better not to be benevolent in a certain circumstance.
And better would be defined in what sense? Because are you saying that among God's goodness, his virtues, they can compete with each other? Possibly,
yes. One thing that could make it better not to be benevolent is if, for example, he'd made a promise. If, for example, it would be benevolent of him to give me a pony for my birthday, but if he's promised to give the pony to somebody else, that's it. I'm out of luck. The promise takes precedence. Also, God's virtues might conflict directly rather than conflicting with obligations. God is supposed to be perfectly just and perfectly merciful. It might be that on a given occasion, the best thing to be is merciful. In that case, he won't be perfectly just. He'll do something different than the just thing.
But the combination, it's like an optimization model, is that between all these competing issues that God's always picking the best weighted average of all these in some way.
Something like that. He'll go with the virtue that it's most appropriate to manifest in a given circumstance. He doesn't manifest the rest, but that's not because he doesn't have them. It's just because the best thing to do there, morally speaking, is to manifest a different virtue.
And therefore it's legitimate to still use the word perfection and his benevolence or his justice, that they're always perfected, because you're saying that it's perfect, but they compete. So one is not ultimately infinite because it's being subjected to a limitation due to the presence of another one.
You have to make a distinction between having a virtue and manifesting a virtue. What I want to say is that God can have all his virtues infinitely and perfectly.
But in the manifestation,
they limit one another.
They limit one another. And in God's choice of how to adjudicate this complex equation of all these different competing virtues, is there one answer that God must come up with because it's the like in linear programming in mathematics, there's always one optimal combination that reaches the frontier of maximality. Is God bound by that?
I'm not sure there always is an optimal answer. It might be that in many cases there are a number of answers, each equally good. And in that case, he would choose based, for example, on his love for certain alternatives. Another way in which he might have more than one option is that there might be a best thing to bring about, and yet he might be morally permitted to bring about something else and might have more love for that other alternative. So that his love might lead him to choose something less than the best alternative because that's the one that most entrances him, so to speak.
Do you privilege obligation over virtues?
I've never thought about that. I don't know what to say.
Well, think about it. God makes a promise. God makes a promise. God has an obligation, and yet, if it determines that some virtue is conflicting with that, can God overrule or the obligation, or does the obligation, as an obligation, remain the dominant force?
The thing is, it's a virtue to meet your obligation. It's a virtue to keep your promises. So I'm not sure there's really an opposition between obligation and virtue there, so much as it might be that some virtues might conflict with others.
Okay, so you're saying...
So what I'm saying is maybe it's really virtue that's the most basic thing.
And so obligation is a subset of virtue, obligation being one kind of virtue.
It's one kind of virtue to meet your obligations.
Okay. Well, how many virtues are there?
There are a lot of different ways of dividing them up. For one, it's a virtue to be honest. It's a virtue to keep your promises, but there might be sort of sub-virtues under that. In other words, it might be one thing to be honest in an emotional sense with those you love, and another sense to be honest as a public official. There might be different types of honesty.
Sure. So I mean, just the big categories. I mean, we talked about benevolence. We talked about justice, and we talked about obligations, and maybe under obligations you have fulfilling, telling the truth, being honest, because those are sort of obligations. I mean, are we dealing with virtues that are 3 or 4 big categories, or am I missing, 10, 15 categories of virtue that I'm not aware of? I just want to get, what's the size of the bread box?
I'm not sure. Particularly, I'm not sure, because even if I could answer that case, that thing for humans, I wouldn't know exactly how well it applied to God. I mean, some human virtues are virtues that God can't have. For example, courage. To be brave, I think, takes being able to at least think that you're in danger and then respond appropriately.
Right, God
or
can't
to feel fear and respond. God can't feel fear, and he can't be in danger, and being omniscient, he knows that he can't be in danger. So courage is a human virtue God can't have. Chastity is another. Obviously, he doesn't have the equipment. So even if I knew how to answer the how big the bread box question for human beings, I wouldn't know how well that applied to God. First, because not all human virtues applied to God, and second, because God may have virtues of which we have no idea.